Today's reading is from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, until Hebrews 12, verse 3. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith he still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of righteousness that comes by faith. By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father, because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sands on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they'd left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, and gave instructions about his bones. By faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. And chapter 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you too will not grow weary and lose heart.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to our Hebrew series. Today we're talking all about faith. And faith is a very interesting topic, I think. One level, faith is kind of used as an interchangeable term for religion. People talk about the Christian faith, the Islamic faith. Faith is also criticised by some in a number of ways. Atheists in particular will often decry blind faith, this idea of believing on the basis of no evidence. Somehow faith is opposed completely to, say, proof or science. For others, faith is seen as a crutch for the weak, something that weak people need to cling on to, some unlikely belief for those that can't handle the real world. For others, perhaps from other religions, Christian faith in particular is seen or can be seen as lazy. What you just believe and that's it. That seems such a lazy way of following God. And there's the issue of how much faith people have. Some people will say, well, I don't have enough faith to believe in God. Perhaps even while they believe in a number of other unlikely or less likely things. At its worst, I think the question of how much faith can lead some people to claiming someone else didn't have enough faith to, say, get healed from some disease, or that the people praying for them didn't have enough faith. And then there's the question of what we need to have faith in. Is it enough to believe that God exists or that Jesus was God? Do we have to believe all the other stuff too, all the miracles of Jesus? Do we have to believe in the virgin birth? Do we have to believe in the resurrection? What are the core elements of faith? Well, today, as we look at this topic, I'm confident we will not answer all these questions, but hopefully we'll scratch the surface of some. And more importantly, perhaps, consider, as we are in this third part of Hebrews, to consider what does it mean for us to have faith? Well, we're back in Hebrews. Hebrews, of course, is in the New Testament part of our Bible. It was a letter written by an unknown author in probably the 60s AD to a group of Christians living outside of Israel. possibly even in Rome, and it was written to show these Christians the centrality and importance of Jesus in what God has done. This is our second week in part 3 of Hebrews, which is called Living Out Faith in Jesus. And today's passage, chapter 11, verse 1 to chapter 12, verse 3, is a pretty famous passage in the Bible, and it begins with a lovely definition of faith. Verse 1, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Faith is described in two similar ways. It's confidence in what we hope for, that is, in the things of the future, the things to come, perhaps the promises of God. And it's assurance about what we do not see, unseen things, things that are not immediately visible. Confidence about future things and assurance about unseen things. And then the author writes, this is what the ancients were commended for. Faith is what those heroes of the Old Testament were known for. And then he launches into this list of such heroes, Old Testament characters that were famous for their faith. From verse 3 to 31, many examples are given. And then from verse 32 to 38 of chapter 11, there's another list of various things that Old Testament people of faith experienced. Have your Bibles open if you can as we go through this passage, because I won't have time to look at all of the characters in detail, but I want to pick up on a few of them and also really focus again on those questions. What is faith and what does it mean for us to have faith today? Firstly, we see in verse 1, don't we, that faith is assurance in unseen things. And then from verses 3 to 6, the author gives a couple of examples of this. The first is that God made the world in verse 3. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. It's a great example, I think, of faith in something unseen. None of us got to see God make the world, did we? We have faith, we have assurance that this is true, that this universe was created by God through God's own plan and purpose. It wasn't the result of random accidents and nature and chance. It was God's plan to make this world. Another example of faith in what is unseen is believing that God exists. The example here is Enoch, who's a slightly mysterious character from Genesis, but he's upheld as a model of this. It says he was commended as one who pleased God and so did not die, but was taken away by God. And it says to be one that pleased God, you have to have believed that God existed. I wonder if this is the classic thing people think of when they think of faith. Faith is belief in the existence of God and maybe a few other propositions about God. For example, that he created the world. And I wonder if this is for some where the idea of a lazy faith comes in. I mean, you think these Christians, right? All they do is believe that a God exists and a few other kind of concepts about God, and apparently they're saved. Is this all faith is? Just mental assent to some propositions about God? Well, certainly faith includes this, as we see here, but it's not limited to this, is it? In James chapter 2, verse 19, we read that just believing in God's existence can't be enough. The author says even demons agree with us on that point. Certainly doesn't mean they're in relationship with God. The verse is, you believe there is one God, good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. And then if you have a look at verse 6 here of Hebrews 11, the author moves straight from confirming faith as belief in God's existence to looking to the future, believing in the rewards offered by God. He writes, without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. That's that second half of the definition, isn't it? Faith is belief in unseen things, like the existence of God, like we've just seen, and it's confidence about future things, like the promises of God. And this section, this part of the definition of faith is the big focus here. Confidence about future things. From verses 7 to 31, all the examples focus on this element of faith. Those who look to the future fulfillment of the promises of God. So Noah, of course, built an ark, a huge boat, trusting God's word about this earth-changing flood that was going to take place soon. He had confidence about the future. Abraham, on many occasions, had confidence about the future fulfillment of God's promises. He left his home country with no clear plan, following God's call. He settled in a foreign land as a foreigner, living as this wandering man. He offered his own son as a sacrifice, or was about to, trusting that God would still make a nation out of Isaac's descendants. Joseph, we read, had confidence in the future plans of God, so much so that he even gave instructions to his descendants about where his bones should be buried when they would leave Egypt, which would happen some 400 years later. Moses, he instructed the people about the Passover because he trusted what would happen just later that evening, that God would bring his judgment on Egypt and spare Israel. And God's people also trusted God. They trusted God when they took those first steps into the dry ground of the Red Sea with the masses of water on both sides. They were trusting God's promise that they would make it. They trusted God when they did those 7 laps of the city of Jericho, no doubt to the jeers and scorns of the inhabitants. But they trusted God's promise that this was the way to victory. Again and again, people who had faith, that is, they had confidence in future things. And more than anything, this is the model of faith that the author of Hebrews is emphasizing. So far, so good. But there's something else going on here. See, at one level, all these people received what was promised, didn't they? Noah trusted there'd be a flood coming, and a few months later he was vindicated when his family survived. Moses trusted God's promise about the Passover, and he was vindicated just the next morning when the Egyptians were wailing in sorrow and the Israelites had survived. But have a look at verses 13 to 16, just for a moment. Right in the middle here of all these examples, the author suggests these people didn't actually receive all that they hoped for in their lifetime. He says all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. It's interesting, isn't it? The author suggests these people were still holding on to faith when they died, looking for something else they had not received in their lifetime. I think it's true. Consider Abraham, for example. Yeah, he lived to see himself become the father of a large family of descendants, but not the multitude that was promised. Or Moses, he got to see God's people safely to the brink of the promised land, but he didn't get to see them enter it or to enter into their fullness as a new nation. And in a much greater sense, all these people, all these faithful ones of old, they were looking forward to, as Hebrews says, a heavenly country, that final place of rest and God's reign and peace. They were all faithful in their time. They all saw something of God's fulfillment of what was promised. But as the author writes, they were still living by faith in the future when they died. Let's be clear here. These people did not die in vain. At the end of the chapter, verses 39 to 40, we read, God has planned something better for both us and them. They were all commended for their faith, he writes, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. These Old Testament saints were ultimately waiting for Jesus. They were waiting for the ultimate fulfillment of everything God had promised in Jesus, just as we've been hearing about in Hebrews part 2. And because we also enjoy the benefits that Jesus has won for us, there's a sense now in which they've kind of caught up to us, and we're now all waiting together for Jesus' return. I was trying to think of a good illustration for this, and I was thinking about our current roadmap in Victoria, the roadmap of easing restrictions across the back end of this year. As you know, in regional Victoria, we've jumped ahead of Melbourne a couple of steps. We've taken a second and a third step. And Melbourne's they're catching up. They're taking their steps too, but they're a bit slower. It looks like Melbourne will probably take another step in October, but we'll just keep in our current circumstances, won't we? And then according to the roadmap at least, the entire state will go to the last step, hopefully in late November. I wonder if, in this sense, we're a little bit like those Old Testament heroes who have enjoyed some of God's promises being fulfilled, just like we've enjoyed those first couple of steps out of lockdown. But we're still waiting for the final step, just as they were waiting for God's final promises to be fulfilled. And at that last step, or maybe the final steps, they happen all together for everyone to enjoy. Jesus' death and resurrection has already happened, and everyone's had the benefits of that. And the final step is Jesus' return to glory. It's not a perfect analogy, but I'm going with it for the moment. Well, what does this mean for us? What does it mean that faith includes confidence about the future? Well, for us, the future promises of God we hold on to are all about when we die and when Jesus returns. We have God's promise that when we die, we will be with Jesus. As Jesus says to that repentant criminal on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." As the Apostle Paul writes, when he's considering his death, he says, "I desire to depart and be with Christ." And we have God's promise that when Jesus returns, we will enter into the fullness of eternal life. Revelation 21, we see on that day, God's dwelling will be with his people. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. We've got confidence and assurance about the future, or about our future, that we're safe in Jesus' hands, that even our death means new life in Jesus. In fact, for the Apostle Paul, he pins everything on the future hope of Jesus. He writes, "If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied." Perhaps this part of our faith can sometimes feel quite distant, maybe even irrelevant to how we live life today. Does our faith in the future promises of God affect my life day to day, right now? Or we might even ask, what does it mean to look like, to live life in light of this promised future? I want to spend a moment thinking about this, because at this point, I really want to say I think the best way of thinking about faith is dependent trust. See, if we think about faith as just belief, I believe in X, Y, and Z, even if one of those things is a promise for the future, I believe Jesus will return in glory. If that's all faith is, just belief, I think faith is stripped of some of its weight. But faith is trust, dependent trust in God. And trust involves action. Trust involves taking steps of faith because we depend on something. There's heaps of good examples in today's passage. Noah trusted God and took the step of faith of building the ark. Abraham trusted God and took kind of a literal step of faith of leaving his home country. Maybe the clearest example is in verses 25 and 26. This is with Moses. It says he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. Moses trusted in what God had promised him so much, he was willing to do two things. Firstly, to reject some pleasures of the world, and secondly, he was willing to accept disgrace for the name of God. Why? Because he was looking forward to his reward. Moses didn't kind of just lean back on some, comfortable Egyptian cushions and think, well, yes, I believe in God and I believe his promises, and now I'm just going to wait and relax until that time comes. No, he trusted that actually what God had was best. And so he acted based on that trust. I think it's really important to get this distinction right between faith as belief and faith as trust. In our Alpha group recently, we talked a little bit about this distinction. And you can do a very simple demonstration right where you are. There's a very good chance right now you're sitting on a chair. Now, you can have faith that that chair can take your weight. There could be lots of reasons for that. Maybe someone similar size to you, sat in it recently, didn't break down. Maybe you've had a quick check to see if there's any damage. Maybe a trusted friend told you, this chair's a good one. Maybe you just needed anywhere to sit and you just sat on a chair. But you could stand there and you could say, yes, Paul, I believe, I have faith that this chair holds my weight. And if you believe the chair holds your weight, that's good. But the point where belief becomes faith is when you sit on the chair. Now you're trusting. Now you're trusting that chair to support your weight. And if your trust has been misplaced, well, you're going to get hurt. That is faith. Trusting in something so that you actually depend on it. You actually lean on it. You take the risk that it could let you down. In our Alpha group, someone mentioned a famous story of this in history, and I looked it up online. On the 30th of June, 1859, Charles Blondin, I believe it's pronounced, a French tightrope artist, he crossed a 340-metre tightrope across the Niagara Falls for the first time. And over the next few months, he would make the crossing almost 300 times to large crowds. And he had lots of theatrics. He pushed a wheelbarrow across the rope. He carried a table and chairs. He even carried a stove and cooked an omelette in the middle of the tightrope. And in those first few weeks, when he made dozens of crossings, didn't make a mistake, he successfully completed every crossing. All the thousands of spectators, if they were asked, they would have said, I believe he can do it. Do you believe Charles Blondin can make the next crossing? Of course, I believe he could do it. They'd seen him do it time and time again. They believed it was possible. Now, on the 29th of July, about a month after his first crossing, Blondin's manager, Harry Colcord, climbed onto Blondin's back and he made the crossing with his manager clinging on. Now that is faith. That's dependent trust in Blondin. All the spectators, they had belief, sure, but his manager had true faith, dependent trust in Blondin, shown by climbing onto his back. Well, what does this faith look like for us today? I want to suggest, like Moses, we are called to make decisions today in light of the faith we have in the future, because we have assurance that our lives and our death are in Jesus' hands. And like Moses, this is usually going to involve two types of things. Firstly, we will say no to some things. In Hebrews 11:25, it's described as the fleeting pleasures of sin. That's going to mean something different for each of us, I think. For some, it'll be resisting sexual temptation because our eyes are fixed on Jesus and the future, and our desire is to live holy lives for Jesus' sake. For some, it might mean being absolutely scrupulous in financial affairs, not taking unethical or illegal shortcuts, even though there might not be any chance of getting caught. It might mean choosing to serve others or give generously rather than serving ourselves or hoarding wealth for our own benefit. That's living by faith, isn't it? Because if we don't really trust that Jesus knows what's best for our lives and the future with Jesus is more wonderful than anything we could imagine today, well, we're not going to give up on those daily pleasures, are we? If none of this is true, it would actually be silly to give up these enjoyable sins. But that's what faith looks like. We have confidence. We have real trust in the future, and it affects how we live today. I mentioned there was another aspect to living lives of faith that we see in Moses, and to consider that, I want to look briefly at the rest of chapter 11. From verse 32 to 40, the author, I don't know, he maybe realizes he's running short of paper or something. He makes this big summary of all these other biblical characters. There's 4 from the book of Judges. That's Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. He throws in King David, and then he says Samuel and the prophets. And he gives a stack of examples of what faith led to, mainly for these prophets. And you'll notice these fall into 2 big categories. Have a look from verse 33 to 35. We read about wonderful things that came from faith. He talks about these people who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped from the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Now, depending on your theology or background, you might be thinking at this point, yes, exactly, this is the power of God. This is what faith means. When you have real, true faith, you're going to see miracles, healing, acts of power. And I want to say, it's true, these things happened. There's a reference there to Daniel who escaped from the lions. You could find the women in the Old Testament who received children back from the dead. Wonderful examples of God's power working through the faith of God's people. But then the list kind of turns from verse 35 to 38. Let me read this. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. What a turn! A moment ago we were celebrating victories and miraculous survival. Now it's acknowledgement of torture and floggings and executions. And it's all by faith. I think these are really helpful verses for anyone wondering if their present difficulties are due to a lack of faith. Maybe you've heard that. If only I had more faith, maybe I wouldn't be in this predicament. Maybe God would have spared me this pain. Maybe I'd see a miracle. Or sometimes, even more aggressively, someone might say to someone suffering, if you have more faith, God will bring this to an end. I want to be clear, God can and sometimes does perform wonderful miracles to deliver his children from pain and grief and trouble. We just read a few examples of that. But it's also true that God often allows his precious children to endure difficulty and challenges and pain. We don't always know why, although we'll look at that a bit more next week. I want to say what we do know is that pain and trouble is not a sign of weak faith. And strong faith does not always guarantee happiness or peace and security in our earthly life. In fact, this here is the second thing living with faith can mean for us. We saw before for Moses, real faith firstly means rejecting the fleeting pleasures of sin, which it does for us. And secondly, it also means, again from Moses' example, chapter 11, verse 26, it means disgrace for the sake of Christ. See, none of these people chose their sufferings, did they? But they endured them for the sake of their faith. They refused to deny God at the pain of death. They went to difficult places, witnessed to difficult people, all because of their faith, their dependent trust on what God had done and what that means. This is what living with faith often looks like, suffering for the sake of Jesus. Well, what might this mean for us in 21st century Warrnambool? Well, let's be honest, it's unlikely to mean death by stoning or being sawed into, but it could mean other forms of persecution or mistreatment. It might mean always being on the outside of a social group, maybe even a group of friends or family. It might mean enduring rolled eyes and shaking of heads and scoffs from others when they hear of your belief. It might mean having your voice ignored or kind of overruled because you come from a place of faith. You might know that experience of something coming up in conversation and you just know you should mention your faith in Jesus, but you know as well that if you do, the conversation will turn against you. This is what living with faith looks like. There's probably some examples you can think for yourself. What is faith? Well, faith is dependent trust in God and his promises, regardless of the cost. Faith is dependent trust in God and his promises, regardless of the cost. And maybe most fittingly, this passage just dips into chapter 12 with one last example of faith. Let me read from Hebrews 12, 1-3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Hebrews 11 is sometimes known as the great cloud of witnesses passage, and sometimes the image people will have is of all these saints of the Old Testament, former believers in God, sort of almost in a stadium, cheering us on as we seek to follow God. It's not a bad image. It's probably not exactly the image the author intended. See, these aren't our cheerleaders as such, these cloud of witnesses, watching us, looking to us. They're our examples. We actually should be looking to them, watching and seeking to emulate them. And to make that as clear as possible, he throws in one last example. He says, even more than those examples, we should fix our eyes on Jesus. Jesus is described as the pioneer of faith. He goes first. In fact, he shows faith in God's promises so that we can follow his lead. And so it says, consider Jesus' example. He endured the cross, not just the execution itself, but the torture, the betrayal, the abandonment by his friends, of course, the agonizing pain and the separation from his Father in those last moments. He endured this and he scorned its shame. He didn't really mind about it because he knew what awaited him, that final seat at the right hand of his Father in glory. Jesus had this deep, dependent trust in his heavenly Father and his promises. And so Jesus is the pioneer of our faith. But he's also the perfecter of our faith. He's the one who gives our faith its substance and focus. The author's probably referring to Jesus' resurrection here. Jesus' own resurrection from the dead gives substance to our faith in the future resurrection of believers from the dead. Jesus' resurrection perfects or completes that faith. It makes it substantial.